So the last part of lecture 4 ticked through a lot of the different general domains of the central nervous system pretty quickly in talking about the different types of fibers. Here we're going to slow it down a little bit and focus on a couple of the slides really carefully. And so we're talking about this internal capsule. The reason we're doing that is because it helps reflect some of the general organization of the brain itself. So we have this sort of opening up of these different types of fibers of passage here. And those fibers of passage run in both directions. Like I was sort of joking about in the previous lecture, was saying they're running north and south. So we have some that are going from the sensory nervous system up to the cortex, and we have some that are going in the other direction. So in this genu region, which is defined in this white circle here, of this internal capsule, this area is carrying a lot of fibers that are going from the cortex, the motor cortex, to the brainstem, so the cortical bulbar. So these are important for controlling the muscles of the face and tongue. And so we can see how they arise here and then project downward into these lower domains here. What we also have, though, what we also have present is that we have thalamocortical cells. So these are cells that are taken from the thalamus and then providing feedback up to the motor cortex. So, those are the types of domains and regions that we can see within this portion of the central nervous of the internal capsule. If we move on and we look into the next portion of this, we find the posterior limb of the internal capsule, this sort of back area here. And these can be actually divided into two different parts, the anterior part and the posterior part. We're going to focus on the anterior part up here and zero in on that. So in this case, what we're looking at is this has corticospinal types of neurons in there. So they run from the cortex all the way down into the spinal cord. Additionally, they run from the thalamus up to the somatosensory cortex up in here. And the synapse up in this region here. And so we're looking at the somatosensory cortex coming into this region here. And then we also have these thalamocortical types of inputs that are coming in from other portions of the thalamus. So they're coming from, like, for example, the pulvinar region of the thalamus, and then synapsing in the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. So we will talk a lot when we talk about somatosensation about the VPM and the VPL, carrying light, touch, and feel, and that kind of thing. So that's going through this anterior part of the posterior limb of the internal capsule. And so when we get into mapping some of those pathways, you can try to imagine how they're kind of coursing through and on up as they synapse in the thalamus, and then on up through this anterior limb here. We'll spend less time talking about things like about the pulvinar nucleus of the thalamus, but it's important for being able to help us be able to track attention and has some limbic types of associations with it, meaning emotional types of inputs associated with it. So moving onward then, what we find is that we have the posterior limb of the posterior part of the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So here what we're looking at is these are inputs that are going into either the visual cortex through the retrolenticular region and reaching back, or we have portions that are going through the sublenticular region, which are going through the auditory cortex. So we've been looking at the side and this kind of depiction of the internal capsule from this area. And we'll finish with talking about this last region up here, which is this the anterior limb of the internal capsule. So we have anterior, we have genu, and here we have the anterior part of the posterior limb, we have the posterior part of the posterior limb back here, and then finally we have this anterior part of this. So this is really, really interesting in terms of connecting thalamocortical. And so the dorsal medial nucleus, which is important, if you lesion that, you can affect memory, you can affect a lot of different emotional processing as well. And these connect to the prefrontal cortex, important for attention and planning. So then if we look through sections of the brain, horizontally. So now we're looking sort of down on the brain at a section of it. Here's our anterior portion, here's our posterior portion, and we can start to be able to appreciate some of these different domains a little more easily, and their organization. So the anterior limb here is extending here, carrying thalamocortical fibers, so here's the thalamus. Thalamocortical fibers going up to the prefrontal cortex and limbic regions that are important for attention and planning. And then we've seen and learned about how we have these different thalamocortical fibers that synapse up for carrying information for motor regions and for carrying input that's feedback for the basal ganglia. Inputs for the somatosensory system here for thalamocortical fibers there. We have this retrolenticular type of domain that's going back to the visual cortex here, the sublenticular part that's going out to the auditory cortex, and so forth. So these different types of limbs of the internal capsule can be visualized here. All right. So the next part of this I'll save into a separate section, and that's getting into the brain atlas and talking about these different domains here.